Want to start reading the Puritans but don't know where to begin? Or do you not know who the Puritans are and want to get to know them? Well, the Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. You can learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. If you use the coupon code Orthodoxy, you can get 10% off of your order. That's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Use the code Orthodoxy to get 10% off of your order. I actually have two of the books right here, two ones that they look interesting. One of them is called The Cure for Unjust Anger by John Downame. I think that I'm saying that correctly, but The Cure for Unjust Anger, and then Contempt, Prosperity, and God's Glory by Jeremiah Burroughs. Both are super interesting. And again, these Puritans, actually, we talk about the Puritans a little bit in this podcast, because in this episode, we discussed Charles Spurgeon, who comes in a long lineage of Puritans in his own family, of nonconformists. And the Puritan writings have been super influential on people like Charles Spurgeon, on my favorite theologian, J.I. Packer, and many others, John Piper. They talk about these Puritans as these kind of great theological figures of old. The best way that I've heard it described is in the beginning of a book by J.I. Packer called The Quest for Godliness. J.I. Packer discusses walking through the redwoods in California and looking up at these massive trees and feeling so small in comparison to these trees as he looks up, and he just sees they just go on and on and on and up and up and up. And he says that is how we should feel in relationship to the Puritans. They're these massive redwoods. They're these theological giants of the past that we should look up to and feel small in comparison to, but try to reach towards what they were doing theologically, what they were actually living out practically in their everyday Christian life. The Puritans are some of the most important writers and thinkers and people in the history of the West, especially for Americans, especially for Protestants in America. And so I really, really, really encourage people to go check out the Puritan Treasures for Today. It is a full set of Puritan writings, John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs. I mean, some of the best theological writers of all time. You can use the code Orthodoxy. You get 10% off. I mean, it's already not very expensive, but 10% off is fantastic. So use the code Orthodoxy to get 10% off of your order. Go to heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodoxy. My name is Andy Schmidt, and I am your host. Today's podcast, I got to talk with Alex DiPrima. He's the preaching pastor at Emannuel Church in North Carolina, and he is a kind of a scholar, theologian, and he's focused a lot of his work on Charles Spurgeon. He graduated with his master's and his PhD from the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the author of many books, including Spurgeon and the Poor, How the Gospel Compels Christian Social Concern. And he's published several articles in the Gospel Coalition, 9 Marks, and the London Lyceum. I think that I'm saying that right. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He recently, though, published a book that I got my hands on called Spurgeon, A Life, a Biography of the Prince of Preachers. I have it right here. I'll put a link to this book in the description of this podcast. It is a phenomenal book. I basically read through the entire thing, and just at the end of it right now, just finishing it off. And it's an amazing book. It's about Charles Spurgeon, known as one of the greatest preachers of all time, if not the greatest preacher of all time. In our podcast, Alex and I discussed Charles. We discussed his conversion, how he came to faith. We discussed how he was a pastor at a very young age, 17, 18 years old, and how he moved to London, how he became the pastor of one of the biggest, most prominent Baptist churches in the entire city of London, and one of the most one of the most storied churches in London. And at a young age, he became the pastor, I think at 22, or maybe even younger than 19, 20, 21. I'm not sure. We'll talk about it in the podcast. And basically just some of the struggles that came along with being a young pastor in such a important role and in a massive city, and with his preaching and with his ministry came the crowds. He gathered together. I mean, people flocked to him, thousands and thousands, up to 24,000 people at one point came to listen to Spurgeon preach. He oftentimes preached to between 6,000 and 10,000 people per week. And he traveled constantly all over the country. And he started a college, a preaching college, a preacher's college, a pastor's college. He started a publication. He was just this huge pastoral figure of the 1800s and one of the most important Christian figures in Christian history, Charles Spurgeon. And Alex DiPrima writes this book, Spurgeon, A Life. It's a phenomenal book. I recommend that everybody go buy this. It's really good to read books about old Christians that don't live today. And I didn't know as much. I knew a little bit about Spurgeon. I knew that he was an exceptional preacher. I knew that his nickname was the Prince of Preachers. I knew that his ministry started very young, but I didn't know all the details. And reading through these details, there were moments as I read this book where I cried, where I really laughed out loud. And it kind of brings you through this roller coaster that is Charles Spurgeon's life. And I think ultimately gives hope, and it's a book that points to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so Alex's writing is phenomenal, and this book is amazing. My conversation with him was super fun. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I enjoyed learning about Charles Spurgeon. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode with Alex DiPrima. Okay, so I'm here with Alex. So obviously I gave the introduction, but we're going to be talking about your book on Spurgeon. It's a phenomenal book. The cover is cool. Every time I looked at this, I thought, well, that'd be cool to have that painting up in my house. But also, this has nothing to do with the cover of the book. I have a 1.5-year-old. Well, it does have to do with the cover of the book, but it's weird. I have a 1.5-year-old, and he says a couple of words. He doesn't fully speak full on English. And the first time he saw this book cover, he kept pointing at it and saying Michael Jordan. And we don't really teach him who Michael Jordan is. We maybe have said the name a couple of times. So now for the past week or so, he just points at it and says Michael Jordan, Michael Jordan. So
that may be the first time Michael Jordan and Spurgeon have been put together, but there's some overlap between those two. One's the GOAT in basketball, and maybe one's the GOAT in preaching, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying you got to send this book to Michael Jordan, convert Michael Jordan. So I don't know.
I'll just say, I appreciate you admiring the cover. I credit to Kathy Whitney. Some listeners may know Donald Whitney, wrote Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life, Praying the Bible. I think he was at Southern, now at Midwestern. Dawn's a friend and has a big interest in Spurgeon himself. Wow. And so his wife, Kathy, does all kinds of beautiful paintings. And she was so gracious to make that beautiful image available for the cover of my book. That painting, I think, hangs in Dr. Jason Allen's office at Midwestern Seminary. But so hopefully people, in this case, I hope they judge the book by its cover. Because the cover is, it's definitely over-promising on the quality of the book itself.
Sure.
At least I hope not,
No, I thought that the writing lived up to it. I was super impressed with your writing ability and skills. And I actually think that probably leads into kind of the first question that I have for you is just on why you wanted to write a book on Spurgeon. Obviously, he's a major figure in church history and super important, but there's been a lot of writing on him and he's a very popular person. So what made you think, well, now is the time for me to write a book on Charles Spurgeon?
Yeah, it's hard to give a short answer to that question.
Sure.
I did my doctoral research on Charles Spurgeon and have done some scholarly work, but then also tried to write books about Spurgeon that would benefit the church. So a couple of other things I put out. Spurgeon and the Poor was my first book. Spurgeon and the Poor, How the Gospel Compels Christian Social Concern. And that was drawing on doctoral research, but trying to write a more popular book that people can read to think through mercy ministry and how Spurgeon did that. Edited volume of his lectures and pastoral addresses. And now this book, we have learned so much more about Spurgeon over the last 35 years or so, especially the last 10 to 15. There has just not been the amount of academic interest in Spurgeon in the previous century as there has been in the last 25 years. The Spurgeon Center and the Spurgeon Library in Kansas City, Missouri, on the campus of Midwestern Seminary is a big part of that. Wow. But there have just been more dissertations written in the last 20 years than have been in the last 120. We have just discovered a lot more, and that academic interest has brought about all kinds of discoveries. And so I think there was a need for a new biography, sort of a popular level biography, something that's accessible to average church member, average person. I try to pull on academic work, but I don't try to write it as though it's aimed at scholars or aimed at specialists. I try to aim it at, the woman in your church who's been hearing her pastor quote Spurgeon all the time. Who's this guy? Well, here's a book, right? The best version of that kind of book was Arnold Dallimore, a very good biography of Spurgeon that came out in 1984. But it was before this huge wave of Spurgeon scholarship and all the new things we've discovered about him. So there was a need for an updated portrait of the man. And that's what I was aiming for with this biography, kind of introducing Spurgeon to a new generation, standing on the shoulders of all kinds of new scholarship and discoveries and resources we've gleaned. The one other thing I'll say is just that Spurgeon also is now far more popular than he would have been in 1984. I mean, he was popular then, but the kind of neo-Reformed movement, the Young Restless and Reformed movement, the Calvinist resurgence, Spurgeon's kind of been the poster child in some ways. He was the figure that movement really seized upon as a representative of Calvinism, gospel centrality, a kind of preaching that is centered on the person and work of Christ, that kind of a thing. So I wanted to write in the context of that new interest in Spurgeon, as well as the new discoveries.
Yeah, it sounds like he would be appreciative of you writing the book, not for the scholars, but for just the everyday Christian. It sounds like that was part of one of the main things that he tried to do in his own preaching, which maybe is something that we can talk about, because I think, there's a lot of things with this book that as I read through it, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, so we're very liberal. And so I'm always feeling like as a conservative Christian, have to kind of evaluate what I'm saying and reading through the lens of, okay, how would this land on the place in which I live? And so sometimes as I was reading this book, some of the things that Spurgeon would say or do, I'd be like, oh no, I like with the megachurch stuff, and we'll talk about it. Like, what would that turn into here in Madison? It would turn into like a disaster, but ultimately it didn't. None of that stuff actually did. And so this is the person of Charles Spurgeon seems like somebody we actually have to study right now in the ever liberalizing world that we live in, because he seemed to somehow toe the line of being totally faithful to the gospel while also building huge things. Like that just isn't happening anymore. So do you know why that is? Does that make any sense of what I just said?
I think so. I mean, I'll kind of speak into it as I understand what you're asking. I think that one thing people have to recognize with Charles Spurgeon, and I try to make this point, I think in the introduction and in the conclusion, there was that phrase the Lord himself used with reference to John the Baptist. He said that he was a burning and shining lamp. And he actually says it to the Pharisees, and you were content to sit in his light. Was it the Pharisees or maybe just the Jews in general? But the point was, this was this extraordinary ministry. It was this unusual disclosure of God's power and presence in the work of John's ministry. It was a burning and shining light. I think there's something of that going on with Spurgeon. I don't think that Spurgeon should be seen at the level of the scope of his ministry as any kind of goal or target for any man. Everything's just bigger and grander and massive with Spurgeon. The numbers sort of, it really presents a problem for the historian to try to understand, how is it possible for one man to produce all this work? And we have meticulous records of it all. The notes, minutes, everything. So that the number of sermons preached, the number of books written, the number of meetings held, the number of organizations started, 66 benevolent institutions started out of the Tabernacle. And he's literally chairing meetings for so many of these organizations. You're thinking, the numbers don't really add up. So it's kind of hard. I say that as someone who studied Spurgeon on the scholarly level, our job as historians is to burst everybody's bubble and say, no one's as impressive as you think they are. All of our heroes have feet of clay, and to pull out skeletons from closets. But it's hard to reckon with the magnitude of his work. So I don't think anyone should look at Spurgeon and say, well, we should be seeing this kind of thing all the time. Why aren't there more preachers like Spurgeon out there? Right. That's not to say, though, there aren't things that are exemplary about Spurgeon. Mm-hmm. So on this point of like church organization and leadership of the church and ecclesiology, I do think there are many things about the way the tabernacle operated and the way Spurgeon sought to lead that congregation that are exemplary. A great book to read on this is Jeff Chang's book, Jeff, Geoff Chang, who's the curator of the Spurgeon Library, one of the leading Spurgeon thinkers in the world today. His book, Spurgeon the Pastor, which is really helpful in showing how meticulously they tracked their membership, how he led the church in a plurality of elders and making sure that they had plural eldership who were visiting members, how they actually tracked attendance and participation in the life of the church, how they exercised church discipline, how they voted members in and out of the church. Just so your listeners have a sense of the scope. But when he gets to the Metropolitan Tabernacle, which was first the New Park Street Chapel, changes its name to the Metropolitan Tabernacle, there were 232 members on the rolls. By the time he leaves, there's 5,311. That was a meaningful membership, an accountable membership, a membership that was overseen by the flock. That wasn't a group of casual attenders who slipped in and slipped out. Yeah. And Jeff's book really captures that well. I cover it some in one or two of the chapters. But I think Spurgeon was a real pastor, but he had extraordinary gifts to do that in ways that I don't think can be replicated really well by lots of people. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a big church, but most churches of that size are not employing the kind of ecclesiology and the kind of pastoral care that Spurgeon was employing in his church. Mm-hmm. So I would not want to say, well, the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London in the latter half of the 19th century was just like many megachurches today. Not as much as the megachurches I'm aware of. Right. But I do think Spurgeon shows if you're going to have a large church, there's a way to do a kind of meaningful membership, a kind of meaningful pastoral care. And again, I defer to Jeff's book on that. And again, you'll see I dropped the crumbs in this biography. I cover some of his ecclesiology, but it was more, even like if your listeners to 9 Marks Ministries, there's a lot of the 9 Marks principles that Spurgeon was already practicing in London in the 19th century.
Yeah, well, the grandness of his ministry and all of the ministries that he started and engaged in some ways would make somebody think that his conversion story would be similar, that it would be this massive, huge, he comes to Christ, and actually it's just the complete opposite of that. And that's one of my favorite stories in the book, because I guess he's literally comes from humble beginnings. And so can you explain this?
He was, some people speak of him in London when he gets there as a kind of country bumpkin, kind of yokel from, the sticks. He grew up in rural Essex. That's like East Anglia. So if you look at a map, it's about 50 miles east of London, out in the country. Yeah. And ends up in the Cambridgeshire area, or in and around Cambridge University. He wasn't a student there, but he lived in the Cambridgeshire area. Was in like what we think of as high school in that area. And he is converted at the age of 15. He's converted in a rural church. He had left that morning, a January morning, to attend his home church. We think he's in the middle of a snowstorm, a blizzard. He's not making much progress trying to go through the snow, and he realizes I got to get inside quickly or I'm going to be pounded with snow. And so he turns off into a little street, Artillery Street in Colchester. He turns off and enters the primitive Methodist chapel. I don't know that he'd ever been there before. It's not far from his home, but he was not a Methodist. And there's a small band of people there huddled up. These are the few people that made it to church that day. As the story goes, the preacher who was supposed to preach there that day couldn't make it. He was delayed due to the storm. And so some humble brother, a deacon or something, Sunday school teacher, decides to stand up and preach the sermon that morning. Spurgeon would later say it was a very stupid sermon. It was the word he used. I don't think they used that word stupid in the same way we use it, but I think he meant by that it was a humble sermon. It was a simple sermon. It was not a sermon that reflected great learning or great ability. But he preached on Isaiah 45:22. Look unto me and be ye saved, all ye ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. And he preaches this simple gospel message on looking to Christ and coming to him and trusting in God. And there's literally like 12 people in the room, according to Spurgeon. And the guy literally looks at Spurgeon and kind of calls him out. He says something like, "You're a young man, you look very miserable today, and you will be miserable in life and miserable in death if you don't obey my text." And, this sort of humble sermon in this country church, Spurgeon meets Christ that day, and he repents of his sins, comes to Jesus, looks to the Lord, and everything sort of sets off from there. It's not long after that he's preaching in barns and in villages and in the open air. After that, a couple of years after that, he's pastoring a church at 17. 2 years later, at the age of 19, he's called to pastor one of the most historic churches in London. One of the points I make in the book is that it almost seems like his call to Christ and his call to the ministry were one and the same. They almost, I mean, that's a mysterious thing, the internal call, and Spurgeon himself spoke of the internal call and the external call. But it's almost like right after his conversion, he just becomes this evangelical activist. He's preaching, he's passing out tracts, he's evangelizing, he's teaching Sunday school, he's going to the prayer meetings. He just kind of leaps out of the womb, as it were, in new birth, just eager, ready to serve his Lord. And that's a bit of that, how he came to faith in Christ. Humble beginnings.
Yeah, for sure. And the guy that preached to him, I think you wrote in the book that he was not very impressive at all. Like, he kind of stuttered. I mean, even his speaking ability was not very good. Do you think that had to do with Spurgeon's later? I mean, in his ministry, he really focused on the simplicity and directness of the gospel, not the. And I think you wrote in there, I think maybe he wrote that the simplicity and the directness didn't mean the shallowness, but it was just the simple, clear truth of the gospel that he preached. Do you think that connects to how he himself was converted, because he was converted through this guy who obviously God is using? God, this isn't like an impressive speaker, which we know. I mean, I know people, and you probably have met people who come to faith through a very grand experience and then try to replicate that the rest of their lives. It seems like Spurgeon actually just didn't do that. He was just like, no, I'm going to keep preaching the simple truth that was preached to me. Yeah.
Spurgeon loved to tell his testimony, and he loved to tell about the simplicity of that message. Again, not simple in terms of silly or foolish, but simple in terms of direct, honest, sincere. And he loved to tell his testimony. One brother, I think it's Eric Hayden, somehow tabulated or counted up that in the 63 volumes of Spurgeon's sermons, his conversion account appears in each one of those volumes. And he used it as a kind of paradigm of what conversion is like. He doesn't. I don't think Spurgeon would say you can't be converted by other means, but the idea of the simplicity of the message: look to Jesus and be saved, come to Christ and trust in Him, turning from your sins, and how in a moment Christ will forgive you if you but come to Him and become His follower. I think that he wanted that message that was the message that saved him. And that was the message that was the touchstone of his whole ministry. We talk about, simplicity, the simplicity of that message. And that, I think, affected the way Spurgeon himself preached. He aimed at a kind of simplicity in preaching that I think is something that can be something of a paradigm and a model for ministers today, where it's accessible, it's clear, it's direct. The message of the gospel should not be encumbered and made complicated. It's for needy, weary, heavy-laden, sinful, sorrowful people who need salvation. And the idea of the simplicity of coming to Jesus Christ and repentance and faith does not need to be complicated. Just one more note on this. J.C. Ryle, who many of your listeners may know, J.C. Ryle himself pastored in the East Country, and then he was the Bishop of Liverpool. He would have been an Anglican. He's most probably well known for his books, Thoughts to Young Men, his book, Holiness, other things he's written. J.C. Ryle is just wonderful. Well, they were contemporaries, and J.C. Ryle wrote a little pamphlet called Simplicity in Preaching that to this day is still very popular. The Banner of Truth, I think, used to distribute it quite a bit, maybe still does. But in his book, Simplicity in Preaching, he commends Charles Spurgeon as a leading example of the kind of simplicity in preaching that ought to mark preachers. So there were others holding him up to say, you see how this brother, Pastor Spurgeon, preaches the simple gospel with directness and sincerity and warmth and earnestness. He's a model for men in how to do that. And I would echo that as a pastor myself and a preacher myself. I view much in Spurgeon's preaching as exemplary. And one of those things is his simplicity and directness and accessibility in his preaching to people of all classes and ages and backgrounds.
So tell me if I'm getting this right, I guess, and tell me, because I want people to understand how he preached. Obviously, you didn't hear him preach. I didn't hear him. Nobody's heard him preach these now because he's dead. But his preaching, I guess, described in the book reminded me a little bit of John Piper. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but I feel like John Piper is, he can be very theologically dense for sure sometimes. But I lived in Minneapolis and we went to his church, and he doesn't pastor there anymore, but he still preaches sometimes. And he will preach with this very authoritative, clear, and simple truth. And for people my age, when we hear the words like simple and clear, it sometimes is, I guess, diluted by the modern non-denominational pastor who is more shallow and more, I feel, condescended by those people. I actually can't stand their preaching, but that's different. That's not what you're saying, right? Spurgeon's preaching with authority and with clarity in a way that is true. He's not watering it down. He's not being condescending and speaking to you as some stupid lay person who can't understand the deep complexities of the faith. Is that right?
No. Yeah,
right.
I would say there are at least 4 similarities between John Piper and Spurgeon, and I've made the comparison before. Piper is different from Spurgeon in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But there'd be, I think, at least 4 things that would be very clearly parallels between them. I mean, I'm reading Spurgeon and I'm reading lots of accounts of people who have heard him preach. I've never heard him preach, but I've read hundreds of his sermons, and I've read by now hundreds of accounts of what it was like to hear him preach. I think the first thing would be what you highlight, that note of authority. I think that both men, I think this would be true of John Piper and it's true of Spurgeon, both men believe that they are speaking on behalf of God. Both men believe that preaching is a thus saith the Lord exercise. Yeah. Peter says in 1 Peter 4, is it 10 or 11? Let him who speaks speak as the oracles of God.
Yeah, right.
And I think Spurgeon was deliberately doing that. I have come here as an ambassador of Christ. I've come here as a man sent to the people to minister his word. And therefore I preach with authority. Authority not grounded in the force of his personality, not authority grounded even just in his office as a pastor. The authority was in the message that he preached. Yeah. And so I think there was a sense when he preached, he believed, I am representing God to the people and I have a right to call people to respond. And I think you see that in John Piper as well, very authoritative in the way he preaches. I think a second overlap would be the earnestness that marks both brothers. John Piper, when you see John Piper preach, I mean, not all your listeners will see my video, but he's engaged, his hands are moving, his eyes are, there's life in his eyes, and there's engagement in his whole being, he's just sort of exploding with energy and earnestness. And you do get the sense that John Piper believes in eternity. He believes in heaven or hell. He believes that how you respond to the message preached matters. He believes that the things he's saying matter earnestly and urgently right here and now and for all eternity. I think Spurgeon was that way as well. He was earnest in his preaching. A third way I think that there's overlap between Piper and Spurgeon is that they both preach big God theology, and that was captivating to a lot of people. In Spurgeon's day and in our day, Piper, I think, would be probably one of the leading lights in the recovery of big God theology, the sovereignty of God, the doctrines of grace, whatever you want to call it, Calvinism. He captivates people, I think, or has captivated people with a big view of God and his grace, a humble view of man and his sin. And I think it was true in Spurgeon as well. Here is God in all his glory and his majesty and his holiness and his perfections. And here's man and his sin. And now here's God's Son to bring about redemption. Those themes were in both men. And the final one I would say is just one that might not be as obvious, but I think should be appreciated. Both men use beautiful language and even elevated language to speak about the truths of the Bible. That doesn't contradict what I said before about Spurgeon's simplicity in preaching. But Spurgeon wasn't up there using slang and being chatty and conversational. You read his sermons and there's almost a sense of like Shakespearean English here. Oh, wow. He used the authorized version of the Bible. He memorized long portions of Shakespeare. He could quote Tennyson and Wordsworth and all these great poets. He read very deeply. He was an extremely intellectual man, bookish man. And he speaks about God in beautiful language. And John Piper, I think, is also very He speaks about God in elevated ways. He uses good, muscular phrases and muscular sentences that evoke big and glorious and grand ideas about God. John Piper wrote a book. I don't remember if Spurgeon was in it, but he wrote a book called something like Seeing Beauty and Saying Beautifully. And he talks about, one of the things he talks about in that book is how language can help us to think more accurately about God and to develop a view of God. And Spurgeon, I think, mastered the English language and marshaled the English language to good effect to serve the spiritual good of people. So there would be parallels, or there would be overlap. I think that John Piper is more overtly doctrinal. He is certainly more exegetically rigored to the text than Spurgeon was.
Sure.
Spurgeon never preached through a book of the Bible in his life. John Piper spent like 9 years in Romans. So verse by verse exposition was not what Spurgeon did. He would preach a verse every Sunday, but it was always spontaneous. It wasn't like I don't know that he ever preached a sermon series in his whole life.
Wow.
It was one-off sermons every Sunday.
You know, the thing that was described in the book about when Spurgeon would preach, even though there'd be 5,000-6,000 people in the auditorium, people would say it felt like he was talking directly to me. That I've actually felt that with Piper as well, where I think I've heard him preach 2 or 3 times, especially the first time. He was just like you're saying, animated with his arms, his whole, I mean, he's just like giving this authority. And it did feel like he's just talking to me, even though there's many people in the room. And that's a unique gift to have, because I don't know really many other preachers today. I'm sure there are other preachers today, but that can almost make you feel like you're in a conversation with the pastor, but not even the preacher, more with like the word of God. You're just like, you're confronting it right on. Yeah.
I think that you would see this in accounts of people who heard Spurgeon preach. You'd see it in the accounts of people who heard Martin Lloyd-Jones preach. You'll see it in accounts of people like yourself and like me who have heard John Piper preach, especially in person.
Yeah. That
God has so used them and blessed them in their preaching that the preaching itself precipitates an encounter with God. I think I've been in the presence of preaching like that, where I thought God is coming to me through his word, through the instrument of preaching, through the instrument of this man. I am encountering God. God is coming to me. He's communing with me. He's disclosing himself to me, and he's using the preaching of this man to do that. I've known preachers like that. I think John Piper is a preacher like that. I think also you see that same kind of thing being said about Martin Lloyd-Jones, that same kind of thing being said about Charles Spurgeon. And we shouldn't be surprised that God uses men in that way. Romans 10 says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. Preaching of the gospel, of the truth of the word, is one of the instruments God uses to excite and awaken faith in people. Excite and awaken going to God and knowing God and coming to a relationship with him. So I think that's what Spurgeon was aiming for in his preaching. I think that's what we see also in the ministry of Dr. Piper. And if you read, by the way, Charles Spurgeon's lectures to my students and read his chapters on preaching, and you read Dr. Lloyd-Jones's preaching and preachers, and you read John Piper's expository exaltation, you will see a through line between those 2 preachers and how they conceive of the task of preaching and what it is preachers ought to be attempting to do and ought to pray for God to help them to do.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this a little bit for a couple of years. I guess I want to get your thoughts on it, because you just talked about how kind of the way that these men articulate and the way that Spurgeon and Piper articulate the truths of the scriptures is beautiful, and it's unique in some capacity. It's authoritative, and I thought about how that relates to personal sanctification, and not only as I listen to preaching, but as I then take preaching in or take the word of God in, and then figure out how to articulate the, I guess, depths of theological truth in the Bible. It feels to me like the better I can articulate the truth, the more sanctified I become. And I don't exactly know. Now, I'm obviously evaluating myself, so somebody else might disagree. But and I've seen that with other people as well, though, where they can articulate very well what they think theologically, and then their life oftentimes, not perfectly, but more so, becomes in line with the articulation of the truth. And it seems like some sort of sanctification process is happening through learning how to articulate the truths of the Bible. What do you think about that? I know there's not much.
Well, I think there's something to that. I think I would not say, and I don't think you're saying this.
Sure.
J.I. Packer, in his masterpiece, Knowing God, distinguishes between knowing about God and knowing God. So we would agree, knowledge of theology does not indubitably lead to greater piety, greater godliness, greater nearness to the Lord. And, to put it in a provocative way, or the way you sometimes hear it, well, Satan knows a lot of theology, right?
Yes.
The Pharisees knew a lot of theology. I mean, I think they were bad theologians, but I think, but you're not saying that. You're saying, is it true though, that in the best case, we would expect growth in knowledge about who God is in truth, in his attributes, in his work, that leads, that bears fruit in greater godliness. Mm-hmm. And we should want to bring out that connection and to pursue that connection. If that's what you're getting after, I would say yes. I would say how we speak about God, and if we think more accurately about God, that will help us. So you could say in a sermon, man, well, isn't God just, well, gosh, God is just so, just amazing, man. Isn't he just awesome, man? Yeah. He's just so big and so great. He's just so awesome. Well, that would communicate some idea.
Right.
Yeah. Or you could say, God is matchless in his majesty and peerless in his perfections. Who could estimate the grandeur and the holiness and the infinity and magnitude of this God? And I'm kind of stumbling and fumbling. I'm making this up as I go. But you could see there's an effort there to, with my language, more accurately convey, to beautify, to adorn the truth I'm trying to convey. And that's not an insignificant thing. The Bible does that. The Bible equips us with extraordinary language that has the effect on people of ennobling their views of virtue and godliness and holiness and God himself, elevating their views. And so I am very much against, as a preacher myself, and as one who has written about Spurgeon, he'd be in line on that. I mean, we would agree on this. Sure. If you want to be irrelevant, and if you want to speak and write in a way that will be forgotten for generations, that no one will remember, and if you want to make a very small impact on people, just downgrade your language to the lowest possible common denominator. But if you want to imbue people with noble and glorious and grand thoughts about God, don't be afraid to use those words that will help people make those connections and to draw out those truths. And I'm not talking to anybody about just using like $1 million words. Like, I'm not saying talk like a scholar, an academician. I'm saying talk in a way that the Bible speaks, that the Psalms speak, that the Apostle Paul speaks in his prayers, the way he speaks at the end of Ephesians 3, or the way he speaks at the end of 1 Timothy 1. See how language was employed to adorn the message that was preached. And I do think that will help people to develop more glorious and grand notions of who God is. Can I just one more example? This is just a hobby horse for me, and you just kind of provoked me here.
That's good.
I want to go off on this, but it's the same thing like with your wife, right? Like if your wife is feeling very vulnerable and she just is feeling very small and she feels just unworthy and whatever, and she looks to you and she says, Andy, why do you love me? What you say in the next 17 seconds matters a great deal.
Sure.
And if all you could conjure up is, well, gosh, you're just so nice. But that's not doing anything for her.
No. Yeah.
But if you could recite a poem from Tennyson, or a Shakespeare sonnet, or you could just in your own language try to capture your sense of her beauty and what she means to you and how you see her in the light of truth. And well, that would fill her mind and fill her heart. And so, man, I guess I'm just trying to say language matters, and Spurgeon understood that. And it matters for theology. It matters for godliness. It matters for relationships. It matters for communion with God. I want to distinguish between that and just using $1 million words. That's not what I'm after at all.
Right. Knowledge that puffs up. I mean, actually, there's two things that I thought of as you were talking. One is the basis for how I've been thinking through that is J.I. Packer. I decided a year or so ago that I was going to read through every J.I. Packer book that I could and read as much J.I. Packer as I can. I love J.I. Packer. He's amazing. So I actually weirdly started with the Heritage of Anglican Theology, but I've read The Quest for Godliness, Keeping in Step with the Spirit, Rediscovering Holiness, reading his one on penal substitution, his essay or his lectures on penal substitution. And then I have over here Proclaiming Christ and the Pluralist. I'm just reading as much as I can of him because I could not get enough J.I. Packer. He's amazing. And he's so clear and logical in his theological breakdown. And so it's good that you brought him up because one of the things
very experiential as a Christian, that kind of Puritan practical divinity, experiential godliness. He's almost like a modern day popularizer of John Owen. Like he brings this lofty theology, but has brought it to the average member, the average Christian in ways that are translatable and without losing the profundity and the punch of that rich Puritan theology.
Right. And it's airtight. His theology is oftentimes airtight. You're not going to be able to get in there and pick it apart because his writings are so good.
Well, you see that in his introduction to Owen's Death of Death and the Death of Christ.
Oh, I got it. Yeah,
rigidly logical, rigidly exegetical, sort of squeezes out, all objection. Whether or not you agree with them or not on limited atonement, it's a masterclass in how to make an exegetical and theological argument.
Right. And it feels like he kind of takes the concept of, we talk about knowing God in his most famous book, Knowing God. But I think that the word knowing there can be changed out with affections or having affections for God. He oftentimes uses the word of affections, which was totally new to me as I read through the Heritage of Anglican Theology, that the purpose of theology was to know God, but to not just know of God, but to really know him, to have an affectionate relationship with him and to actually
to commune with him, to fellowship with him. Those would be some words he uses. Certainly Owen uses those words.
Yes. Yeah. And so first, that was, I love that you bring up J.I. Packer. I'm actually trying to find, if you know any theologians that I can dig into J.I. Packer with, you should let me know because I've been trying to find somebody. But the other thing is the way that you talked about language and a pastor going up and saying, God is just so awesome and he's just so great. It reminds me of, I heard a pastor one time talk about the phrase, God is love, right? How that phrase doesn't have much. It's like looking at a modern painting, a white canvas with maybe like a dot in it or whatever, the terrible modern paintings that we have these days. And it's like you look at it and the painting, the art scholars will tell you this is supposed to evoke some sort of meaning and depth inside of you. And you look at it, it's just a blank painting. It doesn't really have any meaning in it because it's kind of nonsense. That's what I feel like God is love is today. He in this passage, I know he explained that. He's like, that's kind of what that term is. You have to define the terminology. You have to explain what love is, because in our culture, love means affirmation. Oftentimes, love means complete and total affirmation of, most of the time, sin. And if you just throw a blank statement out there and say God is love, people are going to bring their preconceptions into that. You have to define the terminology, which is what the Bible helps us do. And so I was going to ask you about how Spurgeon toes the line here, because he didn't live in as much of a liberal society as us, but he's getting up into the late 1800s, coming in the early 1900s. Things get a little bit out of control as far as liberalism goes. And so how did he toe the line between being clear and plain in his language, but also carrying the depth and weight of the theological truth?
Yeah. If I could just say something on the God is love thing, and then I'll reflect on Spurgeon. I would want to say immediately, God is love. I mean, is that from 1 John 4:8? God is love. That is one of the sweetest sentences in all of the world. And I want to say that sentence 10,000 more times to 10,000 more people in all kinds of different situations, where what they need to know in that moment is that God is love. That's written into the fabric of the universe. That represents the heart of God. That is, God doesn't say that about all his attributes. But there's some attribute. God is holy. I mean, that is
right.
God is love. That is, I mean, I'm not saying God is any less than any of his other attributes.
Sure,
but John reveals to us there, you can think of God in this way. God is love. So I want to say, preachers say that sentence a lot and then define it.
Yes.
You're talking about being contextually sensitive. You know, we live in the world of love is love, right? You know, So if I were preaching on that text, I would define who God is, and I talk about his attributes, and I talk about all kinds of things about God, and then here is love. Here's this reality. We're to think of him in this way. What does that mean? He's conditioned by love. He is regulated by love. He is the definition of love. He owns even the concept of love. There's all kinds of things I want to say about that. And then I want to speak against maybe false notions in our culture what love is.
Yeah.
If love means, and all right, when you hear that word love, and what comes into your mind is blind, amoral, or even immoral affirmation, you are not thinking. God defines what love is, and you need to understand what this text means when it says that God is love. Love means something to this author. Love means something to the Spirit of God who inspired that author, and we can go down that line. 1 John is not very hard to do because love is such a major theme in 1 John, and it's a major theme in John's gospel. Spurgeon was contextually sensitive. Spurgeon would often, he'd be preaching and then he'd say something. He might use a particular word and he'd examine it. He'd look at it for a long time. And he'd say, now, when I say that word, what do I mean? Or he might say, this a better word to describe this principle is this. And this is a word that carries with it this idea and that kind of thing. He loved words. He exhorts his students in one of his lectures, words are your tools. Words are your crafts. Words are your craft, excuse me. As a preacher, you have to be a man of words. You got to be very comfortable with words. And words can better express truth, or it could obscure truth. It could reveal or conceal. It can make a matter more clear. It can disclose a truth more clearly, or it could impair someone's understanding. There's a great quote he has. I might be misquoting it here a little bit, but the essence of it is a preacher's job is not merely to be understood, but to speak so as not to be misunderstood. It doesn't mean that we could always, if I speak to 10,000 people, someone's going to misunderstand me, and I can't help that. But he's talking about clarity and precision in language. So yes, in that, I think you will see in Spurgeon a awareness of his context. He'll be aware if this text uses a word that was thought of differently in Victorian England, he will contrast it with that generation's view of that word, and then he'll define words as the Bible would define those words. And that's the task of preachers today, theologians today.
Yeah, and that's a super helpful point because, obviously growing up in where I've grown up in Madison and going to different evangelical churches or non-denominational churches, these terms, like you're saying, God is love, this stuff was mentioned, it was said often, but it was said with no context. And I've seen what that's done on the contrary to people my age who have either left the church or perverted the definitions of the words to mean kind of what they want them to mean rather than what the Bible says they mean. And that seems to be like to me, and maybe you might disagree with this, but I think that this is true, the fundamental battleground of our time is taking back the meanings of the words in scriptures and applying them the way that Christ did, the way they actually were meant to, I guess, rejecting postmodernism. Okay, good.
Oh yeah, no, I think whoever controls the language controls the truth.
Yeah.
I think that, the words matter. I think that the Bible itself, the existence of the Word of God and our theology of Scripture, our doctrine of Scripture is screaming that point. Words matter, truth matters, revelation matters, and God has revealed himself in a certain way. He has chosen to reveal himself not just by the exhibition of outward actions. He's revealed himself in the form of sentences and phrases and paragraphs and letters and books. And so we are a word-centered people, and the words we use matter. So I would die on a hill. And if you want to apply that to a contemporary issue, you might just even think of the debate over abortion. Yeah, right. I'm pro-choice. Well, what you mean by that is I am in support of the dismembership of vulnerable living children in the womb of their mothers. That's what you're a supporter of. You're not pro-freedom. You're not pro-choice. But one thing that the abortion movement successfully did is it won the semantic war.
Yeah, totally.
This is about a woman's right to choose. This is about being pro-choice. This is about reproductive health.
Yeah, right.
So you see the ruin caused by that. The language is being co-opted. Well, we see that in all kinds of other debates and issues. Spurgeon, a great illustration is Spurgeon goes after this big time in the downgrade controversy at the end of his life. He becomes fastidious about language and how men are using language basically to smuggle in liberal theology. So one of the ways men were talking about, basically he accuses preachers in his denomination of advocating for universalism. And he says the way they do this is by talking about God is love, and they talk about the larger hope. We don't believe in a small hope, do we? We believe in a larger hope. And he calls it the larger hope view, which is nothing other than saying there's no such thing as hell. Penal substitutionary atonement, a kind of atonement that satisfied the wrath of God and made propitiation, that wasn't necessary. We believe in a larger hope.
Yeah.
And Andy, are you an opponent of large hope? You see how language can be used, and God can be slandered by using the very words that are used in the Bible in order to entertain heinous ideas.
Right. No, I totally, that's the, I read, I'm forgetting right. Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It was one of the best books I've read because I was horrific in high school. I was terrible at all academic stuff, but mostly because I felt like they were lying, but I was getting kicked out of class and whatnot. Do you have it back there?
No. It's another book I was going to highlight. And he talks about this book. My wife and I put in new shelves, and it looks like we're moving. We're not, but we're Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Yes, Brave New World
is huge in terms of talking about the importance of language. 1984 by George Orwell.
1984.
I believe that Truman might mention both of those books in Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. But both of those books, 1984 by George Orwell, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, illustrate in a profound way the power of language and the importance of trying to win the debate at the level of language.
Right.
Because whoever controls the language controls the truth.
Controls everything. Yeah. And I just finished How Should We Then Live by Francis Schaeffer, where he breaks down the decline. It's similar to the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. But anyways, all that to say that it took me until I was like 22 as I was reading through all these, just realized, I totally believe a false language structure. Like that's just like I was born into the social imaginary of this false postmodern language structure that allowed for me to redefine things however I seem to think that it fits me. I guess it was a utilitarian type of thing where you can use words to get what you want in the end, and you can manipulate things however you want. And man, that was like devastating. It was devastating and good at the same time, because I was like, wow, I'm constantly lying. So I had to realize that I was constantly lying about everything. Like every word that I was using was a complete and total lie. And it was a lie that was given to me by the public school system, by a lot of churches. They engaged in the same thing. And also I had to realize that and it's probably why I've kind of focused a lot on language and how I can articulate my faith as best that I can, is because I feel like in the articulation that I've received from certain theologians and from certain people like Carl Trueman and J.I. Packer, and reading these books, they have helped me kind of break through the expressive individualism that I grew up in, and have helped me see the gospel for what it actually is, not just this shallow, false, boring story of Jesus, but actually something even more profound, more true, more glorious, more beautiful than that. And
the power of God unto salvation.
Right. And that's what I think a lot of young people need, but the church is continuously trying to integrate. I mean, there's this conversation of integration. How can we integrate the culture with the church? And at some point, I think there needs to be a recognition that there is no longer the ability to integrate when the language is fundamentally different, right? Would you agree with that? Because Spurgeon talks about how he talks to the people like they need to be talked to of his time. But I don't think, and you probably know this better than me, but it doesn't seem like their social imaginary is completely liberal and expressive individualist. So there's more room for some of the terminology to just be understood on a base level.
Well, his culture is at least nominally Christian.
Yeah.
There's a massive evangelical influence in London. He could probably assume more, but he really doesn't. I mean, he preaches. He is willing to start with the 101.
Yeah.
His sermons don't read like academic lectures.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something to that. But Spurgeon he probably had the benefit of working within a cultural framework that was more culturally Christian than our world today, at least in terms of where I live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is still the South. There's a lot of cultural Christianity in North Carolina, but it's changed. I mean, it's been a blue state in the last several elections. Not that by being blue, that means it's not Christian. I just mean there's a large progressive influence. There's a large secular influence. The universities, Duke, Wake Forest, Chapel Hill, are more liberal in their orientation. So, we speak in a different culture and context, and but the task has not changed, right? God's word is perennially relevant. It is transcendent. Mm-hmm. It speaks to every generation and every culture. Mm-hmm. So preachers need to do the same thing Timothy was called to do in 2 Timothy 4, to preach the word, to be ready in season and out of season, to rebuke, exhort, correct with all patience and teaching. We're just doing the same thing the apostles were called to do, and there will be different challenges in each generation and in each culture, but preach the Bible, explain the Bible, explain God as he's revealed himself in his word. And if we have to do in our day, Andy, more deconstruction at the level of language before explaining the Bible, well, then that might be a special task that we need to do, or to say, hey, even just introduce the idea that there is such a thing as real truth, and that truth is not malleable based on how you feel or what your individual experience is. Maybe we have to do a better job of explaining that and then showing what the truth is as it is revealed in Jesus and as it is revealed in the word. So I'm all for you, brother. May God give us help to do that. We have to meet the culture on the battlefield with the truth of God's word and preach it in a way that will address maybe some of the special, unique challenges of our own generation. But I do just want to put that word out. The Bible, the task has not changed.
You're right. Totally.
Though the context in which we're performing our task may be a little bit different.
A little bit, yeah. But people are still sinful, and they just need to hear the truth. Yeah.
Yeah, and they actually, I think, deep down, know there is a God.
Yeah.
And they are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. And at the end of the day, it is in some ways this simple. We are rebels against God. We're sinners in our hearts. We have an innate knowledge that we are created beings, that we're answerable to God. And I can appeal to any man's conscience as much as Charles Spurgeon did that in Victorian, London in the 19th century. Right.
And actually, when you were talking about abortion, that is in some ways, I guess, some of what you're saying was reflective of kind of what Spurgeon was talking about with slavery. And so can you explain that whole situation with slavery? Because this was one of the points of the book where, as I was reading, I was like, obviously cheering Spurgeon on, but like, he's intense here, man. So explain that.
Yeah. Well, so Spurgeon gets to London in 1854. He's pastoring this growing church, massively growing ministry, publishing sermons, all this kind of stuff. And this is the prelude to the American Civil War, right? The 1850s. The war starts, in 1860, I think?
Yeah.
So Spurgeon is vocally opposed to slavery. He discovers, 1857, 58, 59, he discovers that his American publishers, the guys publishing his sermons in America, which were wildly popular.
Yeah.
And Spurgeon's sermons were being published on a weekly basis in the New York Times.
Yeah, I know.
It was just wildly popular.
Bring it back. Let's bring that back.
Yeah, right. Well, I wouldn't hold your breath that we're going to see those sermons in the New York Times again. But his publishers in the South were meticulously editing out any reference to slavery in his sermons, so as not to offend Southern Christians.
Right. Spurgeon
becomes aware of this and mandates that they not do that, and starts making much more vigorous statements even than he had been making before. And the statements are incredible. I mean, he says things like, I'm not willing to sit at the communion table with a slave owner, with a man stealer. He is vigorous and vehement in his denunciation of the institution of slavery. He calls it, he says, men these days, well, I'm paraphrasing him here, but something like they like to dress it up in neat little phrases. They call it the peculiar institution. He goes, I suppose it's a peculiar institution. Kind of like how the devil is a peculiar kind of angel and hell is a peculiarly hot place.
Yeah.
He he will take the full power of that kind of rhetoric and that language and marshal it against the institution, the injustice.
It's like G.K. Chesterton. That was just like, as I read, I was like, this is G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, yeah, there's some overlap there. Spurgeon's a better theologian, but he has that same punch with language.
Yes.
And what happens is his publishers in the American South begin to cease all publications of his sermons. Wow. In many southern towns, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, they start having community book burnings. Wow. So slaveholders and others, I share some of the accounts in the book. I footnote some of them. We have these newspaper accounts of people saying, y'all come down to the town square. We're going to be burning our Spurgeon books today. Wow. You have death threats that he's getting from people in America. If you ever come over here, a cord is going to find its way around your neck. You're going to hang
from Christians. From so-called Christians.
Professing Christians. Yeah. In my own state, there was an effort in North Carolina to pass legislation to ban Spurgeon's sermons from being published.
Yeah.
Wow. So I mean, it's just crazy to think about. In Virginia, in some town, there was an ordinance that was basically Spurgeon's sermons became contraband. You had to, if you were found with them, they were going to be confiscated. And what happens is Spurgeon loses he suffers because of that, not just in terms of his reputation in America, but also he loses a large source of income that was being used entirely to support the work of his pastor's college. That was like a training college, what we would think of as kind of like a seminary. He had started this college and he was using all the sermon sales in America to fund the college and to train men. And he lost that whole revenue stream dried up. And so it wasn't without a cost that he made these great stands. And he ultimately found another way to raise money for the college. But yeah, I think that's one of those areas in Spurgeon's life, and I document this in pretty good detail in one of the chapters. I think he comes across as positively heroic in his standing against slavery. Yeah. Right. And there should have been more men on both sides of the Atlantic who were talking that way about slavery. Would that there were more a lot sooner than that. But I'm grateful that Spurgeon did speak out. That's just a very bright part of his story.
Yeah, well, it's encouraging even to read that, what he says about slavery in our times, because as far as I'm concerned, slavery is horrific, but I don't think it's as bad as abortion. I just think, and it's not as massive as abortion. I mean, we've slaughtered 70,000 babies, or 70 million, sorry. And that's not even including IVF and the pill. And so it's probably hundreds of millions. And in 50, 60, 70 years, and in America, in the West. And so just to kind of, I guess I hear a lot of pastors these days in America equivocate and talk around the abortion issue, or just completely stay away from it. And it's the most important issue of our time. And one of the main things about Spurgeon that I thought was incredible as I read through the book was there's just this level of this. He just like, this is the truth. I don't really care if you don't like me for saying this. I don't care what this is going to do. And even in America, when they shut down, putting his sermons out and publishing them, it was obviously difficult on him, but he found another way to get the money for the college. So there was an attitude of like, I'm not going to compromise just to get these people to like me, which is totally, you don't find that today very often. And we have issues that are bigger than the slavery issue, in some ways in America. So
one of the traits that is definitely, you could just see this in numerous examples across Spurgeon's life. Compromise was not a word in his vocabulary.
Yeah, right.
He just when he was convicted of the truth, he would not let go. And you see that in that instance. You see that in a episode I recount, the baptismal regeneration controversy in 1864. You see it in the downgrade controversy. You see it in his conviction and his early sermons. Yeah, I mean, he just doesn't. That's not. I think we're all to some degree affected by fear of man and wanting to court popularity, right? And there must have been some shred of that in Spurgeon, but he is a model, I think, in that regard. It does not show up very often. A kind of a willingness to sacrifice truth to accommodate some pragmatic end. Yeah, he is pretty fastidious and determined and convictional when it comes to standing on the truth and standing for the truth, come what may. And there are many episodes in his life where he suffers significant personal loss out of conviction to stand on the truth and to say what is right.
Yeah, and it's admirable because it's hard to find, and it was encouraging to read, because I've actually, interestingly, as I've read a couple of the past books that I've read have seemed like directly related to some of the issues and things I'm going through right now. And the church that I went to for 10 years here in Madison has decided to partner with a church that's pro-abortion and all this terrible pro-trans, pro-homosexuality, and it's one of the bigger churches here. And I spoke out against it, and they went after me, and I tried to talk to the elder. It's a whole thing. But anyways, as I read through, and we've since left the church and gone to a different church. But as I read through people like Spurgeon, and I see him, and Packer was similar with the homosexuality thing in the Anglican church, and Piper has always been like this, and he's always just very straightforward. That seems to be one mark on some of the greatest pastors and leaders in the Christian faith, and their ability to just say, "Look, man, this is just what I'm convicted of, and I'm not going to let this up. I don't think that it's okay for us to go in this direction or whatever." And to a lot of these people, it has severe costs. But as I've read through Spurgeon, I thought, well, like, if Spurgeon is doing this at the massive level that he's on, it is only our responsibility, my responsibility as a Christian, to do this at the smaller level that I'm on. Because the reason that these guys are doing these things is, one, they want to glorify God, but two, I think it's to encourage people at the smaller levels to say, look, if I can sacrifice at the large level, you should be able to sacrifice at the small level. Do you think that's true of Spurgeon, that he wanted people to replicate him in that unwillingness to compromise?
Oh, certainly. I don't think he would go as far as to say, hey, I'm a great model of this, follow my lead. Sure. But he definitely is encouraging his students, be beholden to no one but the truth and to God himself. Yeah. That you are answerable. You're a man of God. You're a man of the word. And you must be ready to speak for the truth, to sacrifice for the truth, to die for the truth. Yeah. That comes through in a major way. There's a book of Spurgeon. Well, it was originally a series of addresses he would give. The Pastors College had an annual college conference, and all these former graduates of the college would come together, and kind of like his version of T4G or something like that, or bringing all these different pastors together to consider sermons together and hear reports and all that, and a collection of those. He'd give the big address every year, and it was these were gathered up in a book called An All-Round Ministry. Okay, and it's basically just a bunch of Spurgeon sermons to pastors. That theme of being men of the truth and men of conviction and men who speak come what may, men who are willing to be persecuted for righteousness' sake, men who are willing to be like the apostles and the prophets, men who are willing to be like the men in the book of Acts who spoke the word despite opposition. Those themes are quite prominent in those sermons. So when it came time for Spurgeon to speak to pastors, which that book so well captures, his messages to pastors, that theme is amplified in a major way.
And I want to actually talk about his preaching, because you had the chapter on the Prince of Preachers. I mean, that's his nickname, or I guess that's just what we call him now, the Prince of Preachers. And you talk about some of the characteristics that made him a Prince of Preachers, that gave him that title. Can we talk through those characteristics and then discuss whether or not those can be replicated, or whether or not some of these things were unique to Spurgeon? But explain those.
Yeah, I would suggest, I think in the book, I identify three main traits of Spurgeon's preaching that I think, the question, I think that's the one topical chapter in the book. I try to tell kind of a chronological narrative, but I pause in the middle of the book to say, okay, why are all these people going after this man? Why was his preaching so powerful? What made him the Prince of Preachers? What would it have liked to hear Spurgeon? What would stand out to me about his preaching? What was so extraordinary about it? Now, you could read hundreds of sermons, and I think you'd get it. But I'm assuming not everybody who's reading my book has done that. So I suggest, after reading, again, hundreds of accounts of people who sat under his preaching, and then reading hundreds of the sermons themselves, three things that kind of, I think, are definitive of, we could say, Spurgeonic preaching. Okay. The first and the prevailing one would be his Christ-centeredness. Yeah. The person and work of Christ is so prominent and so central and so interwoven into everything. This Christ drips off the pages of these sermons as you read them. Right. And I think anyone who's read more than a sermon or two would say that, just the centrality of the person and work of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the one in whom is found all theology and all truth.
Right.
That's everything in Spurgeon's preaching. And more than that, I say he's a Christ-centered preacher, both in terms of the content or the matter of his message and the manner in which he preached. Matter and manner.
Okay.
Content and character. Spurgeon, I think, in his preaching embodied something of the person of Christ. Mm-hmm. I think he came across like Christ. I've said this before. I'm very grateful that the man whose preaching I grew up under, I would say, I remember thinking as a boy, if Jesus is like my pastor, then I can go to Jesus.
Sure, yeah.
And that was saying not just something about his doctrine or what the message he preached, but his deportment, his bearing.
Okay.
He was like the Lord. And I think in preaching, there was something of that with Spurgeon, a Christ-centeredness that came across in his appeals, his heart, his sincerity. There was something about his bearing. He was Christ-centered in his matter. Yeah. He was Christ-centered in his manner, Christ-centered in his content, and Christ-centered in his character. Right. Christ-centeredness, the second I identify, I think this is in order. The second is maybe his simplicity or his accessible style, his popular style. Yeah. I don't mean popular in that he was like, a late night host or a really cool guy or really, he probably would have been a great late night host. He was pretty hilarious, but no, I just mean in the sense that he spoke to the people. Yeah. He spoke to the average man on the street. He was able to engage with people, and he took them in with the way he spoke. He was engaging. He was able to disarm people and draw them in. There was a directness and a frankness and a warmth and an accessibility, a popular style. He was a popular preacher in the best sense. Yeah. And then the third thing I identify is his earnestness. Oh, he teaches a lecture that's in Lectures to My Students called Earnestness, Its Marring and Maintenance. Every preacher should read that chapter, Earnestness, Its Marring and Maintenance. But so many of the people, I kept hearing this word every time I'd read these accounts of Spurgeon's preaching, the earnestness of this man, the intensity of this man. And I think what comes across there, the idea there is he believed, as we were saying earlier with Dr. Piper, in the eternal relevance of everything he was saying. Yeah, right. I think he believed, here are these 6,000 people in front of me. For many of them, they will, whether or not they spend an eternity in heaven or hell, will depend on how they respond to the words and phrases I'm saying right now. Yeah. He believed spiritual warfare is happening in preaching. He believed that angels and demons and spiritual powers looked upon the whole affair, and Satan had an eternal interest in the outcome, and God himself was using preaching to bring about to bind and loose in the kingdom of heaven. I mean, so, and that came through. Spurgeon wasn't detached and removed and cold-hearted. He was animated. He was hot-blooded. You could see in his eyes a kind of earnestness and urgency and come to Christ, turn from your sin. So he didn't speak like academics in a lecture hall. Right. He didn't speak like many of the preachers of his day in the Anglican Church who were stuffy and stultified. He says at one point, much of the preaching we hear today, these preachers got to get all the stained glass out of their throats. He's just not warm and engaging and earnest and pressing the truth on people. It's preached in a way that's detached and removed. Yeah. And Spurgeon was not that way. Spurgeon was earnest and urgent and compelling, and he believed this was the most important activity in the world, what I'm doing right now. And I think the effect that had on people is they thought, this man in front of me, whatever I may think about him, he believes every word he says down to his toes, and he wants me to believe it. That's how I would characterize, I think, what people are getting after there. Right. So those would be three of the prevailing qualities. A lot more I could say about his preaching, but those were the three things that I think people would say, these were the big defining things that sort of capture something of why his preaching was so compelling and so powerful in his own day. And I do think, Andy, on all three of those things, those should be pursued today. He's a model in that regard. None of us will do it as well as Spurgeon. but we can all labor to be more Christ-like and Christ-centered in our preaching. We can all labor to be more warm and popular and accessible in our preaching and to speak to the common man. And we can all labor to be more earnest, genuinely earnest in our preaching as well.
I wonder how difficult it was for him, or if it even was difficult. I don't know if he wrote about this at all, to have such massive crowds. I mean, it was, I don't know if we mentioned in this podcast yet, but 6, 7, 8, 10, 15,000 people at one point, 26,000 at that one, where was that?
About 24,000 or something. 24,000.
Yeah. So massive. I mean, every week he had tons of people listening to him, and for him to be seeing the spiritual realm, or to be so earnest and so straightforward and have so much zeal for the gospel, and not to have as much care for the praise of man, like that's rare, man. I like, how does he do that? Because I don't know. I guess we just live in the time of pastors who, a lot of these big popular pastors here all the time, just falling, doing something immoral, or their ministry just falls apart because they're more after the praise of man than they are the praise, or I guess to glorify God. How did he do that? Do you know how he did that?
Well, I think that Spurgeon would say he had a long-standing battle with pride.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't think he would say that he was at all times pure-hearted in his motives and in his attitude. He talks at times about how there were times he was guilty of enjoying the praise of man and enjoying the applause. He calls pride at one point his darling sin. That he would sometimes pull it close and cultivate it. And he talks about having to be brought low, and the Lord humbling us, and the need for the Lord to humble us lest we become too puffed up. And he tries to help his students learn, in that area from things he's learned. He talks about not believing your press, not believing every good thing people say about you, and not taking criticism too badly to heart because they don't know the worst about you. God could bring much stronger criticisms against you than even your worst critic. So, yes, I think that he had a struggle with that. I don't think that he was just immune to fear of man, or immune to loving praise and applause, or immune to courting man's good opinion. I do think that the Lord helped him and delivered him from being encumbered by that to too great a degree. I think that we see a guy who is fighting a battle with pride and fighting a battle to keep a pure heart and be pure in all his motives and pure in his preaching, and a guy who ultimately did that successfully.
Yeah.
But not without mistakes. So he will say that there were times he preached out of a motivation to be, liked, well liked, and appreciated. You will see traces of pride in some of his things he writes, even about himself. But it was something, I think, given the remarkable, we could say, success that he had, I think that he comes across largely as one who fought pride successfully and fear of man successfully by God's grace.
Yeah, totally. And it seems like he had to be very vigilant, or somebody would have to be very vigilant and very able to examine themselves and to be very self-reflective. And did he spend a lot? I assume you've written a lot of, or you've read a lot of his personal writings. Did he write about this stuff specifically? I know you just mentioned he wrote about having to fight pride. But did you sense that he was a person who was examining himself constantly, trying to figure out if he's in right standing with God, or how did he do that functionally?
Yeah, well, he's pretty self-reflective in his writings.
Yeah.
He will speak about internal conflict he feels. He'll speak about internal dialogue he feels. You'll see that certainly in letters he writes. He can be very self-reflective about what's going on in his inner world. You'll definitely get in his sermons. He was unusually transparent for a Victorian preacher in terms of willing to relate to his congregation, things going on in his heart, struggles that he had, ways he was suffering, ways he was fighting sin, ways he... even at times he would share in sermons struggles he was having with assurance. We have sermons where he even says, this week I struggled to believe that I'm even a child of God. I felt like I was a non-Christian. I mean, he would say that openly from the pulpit. So he's very transparent there. In reflecting on the struggle with pride and the struggle with fear of man, you'll definitely see that in lectures to my students. That comes out in a couple of ways where he will tell his students, he'll be open about, here's something in my ministry I've had to learn. Here's ways that the Lord has tried to prune and refine me. See, I'd say his letters, his sermons, and then in lectures as well, you'll see him being pretty open about, he was willing to disclose things that were going on internally and internal battles and struggles that he was having in his ministry in his life as a Christian.
Okay, yeah. So in reading the beginning of your book, it felt like, he had these night terrors and he would see hell and he would have visions of hell in his mind or things like that were very dark. And now that you're mentioning that he would say sometimes from the pulpit, hey, I don't even know if I'm a child of God. This week I doubted if I was even saved. Yeah. It seems like he felt things deeply, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. I was surprised by, as a child, that he had those visions, because that's dark and very emotional stuff.
He had a vast inner world, and a vast capacity to emote. And later on in life, there are very evident struggles he had with depression and melancholy and despair.
Yeah.
I think we could say they would have used the word anxiety in the same way we would, but struggles with anxiety to some degree. Oh, yeah, he could be brought very low and he could become very dour. He could go through, he says he often went through what he called the slough of despond. He used John Bunyan's language in Pilgrim's Progress. And yes, he was a vastly emotional man. I mean, not like that he was unstable or anything, but he could go to some degree vastly from pole to pole.
Yeah.
Some days he could feel triumphant and ebullient, and the next day he could be thrown down with deep discouragement and despair. His wife would speak sometimes of finding him at the foot of the stairs just weeping and not being able to identify the reason why. Wow. He had a vast emotional capacity. And sometimes that was used, he was able to leverage that to his great spiritual advantage. I think it's why he was such a great preacher. He was a experiential preacher. He could help connect people experientially to the truths he was saying by narrating some of his own experience, some of his own inner struggles. Right. But at the same time, that vast experiential and emotional capacity could cause him to sink lower than some men would go.
Yeah.
He could get very low, very far down, and be deeply discouraged.
Wow.
And he did at times struggle with even assurance of salvation, where at times he felt, am I even a Christian? Satan is tempting me today. I'm having trouble seeing God's face, and I'm going to his word, but it seems that I'm losing the light. And he would speak that way at times. I think ultimately he was largely a well-assured Christian man. Yeah. But at times he does struggle in that arena. And I think some of that might come from constitutional elements about him.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of at the end of Rediscovering Holiness by J.I. Packer. He talks about Mother Teresa and how throughout her life, throughout the vast majority of her life, she felt very distant from God. And and how she continued to pursue holiness and righteousness even in the midst of that, and how there was like a 2 or 3 week span in the middle of her life where she felt super close to God, and then it just went away and it never came back again. And so he talks about that as how, you can actually get through that, but you have to pursue holiness even when you're not feeling like it. And it was so that just reminds me of the same thing, because Spurgeon he's an up and down type of character, which a lot of people I think might feel like, okay, well, how do you even function as a Christian in that weird kind of all over the place life? And yet Spurgeon has seemed to do it with actually a lot of success, and he actually seemed to have a deep faith in Christ and a willingness to continue to pursue the truth and to pursue holiness, even though he wasn't always feeling like it. And in today's day and age, that's a difficult thing for anybody, because our culture is so dead set on trying to convince us that how we feel is the ultimate truth. And Spurgeon seems like denied that. And he said, well, that might not actually be true. What is true about me is what Christ says, not exactly how I feel.
Yes. Well, yeah, a simple way I've put that often to our congregation, and maybe I heard someone say this, we must at times believe better than we feel.
Yeah, right.
And I think the Spurgeon models that well.
Yeah.
He even speaks in that kind of a way, the need, even when my feelings fail me, even when I don't feel close to the Lord, even when I feel like in the depths of my sin, I need to return to the things that I know. I need to call to mind the things that I surely believe, the things that are true about God and his grace. I need to remind myself of the these great realities, and that may not change my emotions immediately. I may not have this rush of warm affections that I want to have. But when my feelings are not what they ought to be, return to the truth, believe better than you feel at the present moment, and God will return to you again. God will bring to you grace. He will bring to you reassurances of his love and of his mercy and of his gospel. And again, I think models that, lives that out successfully in a way that is really helpful for Christians today.
Yeah, totally. So there's one more question I want to ask before we wrap up, and it's I guess in some ways an application question. Maybe I just want to ask you, what do you think that we should be learning primarily from Spurgeon today, and even what do you think Spurgeon would say about the modern church in the West and in America? So I guess maybe you can take those in whatever order you want to take them in, but what can we gain from knowing Spurgeon's life?
Oh, the lessons, brother, are innumerable.
Right.
Innumerable. I mean, I would just encourage people to read about his life. You could use my biography if you'd like, or Arnold Dallmore's biography, get acquainted with this man. I think if you read my biography or another good one, you will want to read more of Spurgeon, read his preaching, and learn more of his life, and to make him a kind of lifelong friend. The lessons are innumerable. I mean, you ask about the Western church and where we are today. I think that we are always in danger of, in the church itself, I'm not talking about the wider culture, in the church, of giving into pragmatism and compromise. That's just always looming at the door. Yeah. And so a lot of the conversation we had about Spurgeon's dogged commitment to truth, no matter what. Truth despite consequences. Truth despite persecution or opposition or hostility. I think that's a message we need to hear today. I need to have that just in our bloodstream, in our DNA, in our backbone. That's a big one. I think Spurgeon would say to preachers today, keep preaching the word. Don't dilute the message. This is the word we've been given to preach. We may not tamper with it. And we need the full exhibition of the truth in our day and our climate. And I think he'd warn preachers today about tampering with the message or diluting the message. I think that Spurgeon would be concerned about the prevailing worldliness that marks a lot of churches and so-called Christians in our day. I think that Spurgeon would be pretty shocked at how much we have imbibed the world in our ways of thinking, the ways we conceive of relationships, the ways we take in entertainments, the way we dress, the way we use our free time. I think that he would be concerned that there is not as much of a sort of earnest interest in the cultivation of piety and holiness and godliness and virtue. And he would be discouraged by that. And he would warn the church against that we have made friends with the world far too much. And the church is losing something of its unique savor in terms of holiness, a likeness to God and likeness to Christ. So that's a smattering of 3 or 4 ideas that might speak to the church today. And
that's because Spurgeon was in the line of nonconformist, in the line of Puritanism, and of course the book "The Quest for Godliness" by J.I. Packer, where he talks about the Puritans. That was one of the obviously the primary things. The Puritans, they were focused on purity, godliness, holiness, being separated from the world.
And walking with God, fellowshipping with God. And we don't talk that way today. No. I will say, by the way, I'm grateful for the big endorsement of Packer that this podcast has been. And I want to say, because I love J.I. Packer, I would say before anybody reads Spurgeon, A Life by Alex DiPrima, pick up Knowing God by J.I. Packer and A Quest for Godliness.
Yes.
Those 2 books may be in my top 5 favorite Christian books of all time. And those are just superb. Spurgeon would give them a ringing endorsement. He would hate J.I. Packer's Anglicanism, but he would embrace the brother and love him, and he would applaud those books. And I think Spurgeon himself in his own day was trying to recover that same kind of theology, spirituality, fellowship with God.
Right. Packer's weird because he's not weird. It's just difficult for me because every time I read a new thing, I'm like, oh, that's my favorite. And then I read another book. Oh, that was my favorite. I think I'd put at this point a Rediscovering Holiness. And I think that's just because it's something that's not talked about. And it was refreshing to hear somebody be so clear and forthright on it. But they're all amazing. Packer's awesome.
Fundamentalism in the Word of God.
Oh, I got to read that.
Keep in step with the Spirit.
That's
so many. Yeah.
So good. Well, Alex, I seriously appreciate you coming on the podcast. And your book it's awesome. Spurgeon of Life. I'll put the link to buy it in the description. I think people should go buy it, should read it. It's, I talk a lot about theology on this podcast. I talk about different theologians on theological concepts, but sometimes this is refreshing to hear about somebody's life and how they took the theological concepts and actually lived it out and actually did something, built a ministry and brought the gospel to the places where it never had gone before. Your writing is amazing. I was super impressed with it. And so I just appreciate you taking time to do this and writing the book.
Oh, brother, I appreciate the encouragement. It's a privilege to be on with you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Same. Well, thanks. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of Orthodoxy. I hope you really enjoyed this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I thought it was very fun to make. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an update, a little bit of a reason for you to subscribe to the channel, to follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to this podcast. There's some really, really exciting episodes coming up in the next couple of months. Next week, I'm going to be interviewing Tammy Peterson. That's Jordan Peterson's wife. She recently converted to Catholicism. So we're going to kind of talk through that, talk about that. I have a decent amount of time to talk to her. So I think it'll be a really interesting, really fun conversation with Tammy Peterson. Then a couple weeks after that, I have two podcasts. One of them is with a guy named Samuel Parkinson. He recently wrote a book, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then I also have a podcast the next day after that one with a guy named Robert P. George. People should know who Robert P. George is. If they don't, they should just look him up. He's a kind of a political thinker at Princeton University. He is he's a McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. He has received the Presidential Citizens Medal, the Bradley Prize for Intellectual and Civic Achievement, and the Canterbury Medal of the Beckett Fund of Religious Liberty. He chairs the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and has served on the President's Council on Bioethics. Professor George holds degrees from Swarthmore, Harvard, and Oxford. He's probably got more accolades now because that was just a description off of the back of one of his books that was written a little while ago called Conscience and Its Enemies. That's the book that we're going to be discussing. I actually reached out to him, asked him to come on the podcast. He said yes. I said, what book do you want me to read of yours? And he said, read this one and we'll talk about it. So I'm just starting it, but it's phenomenal already. It's very interesting. Carl Trueman was one of his students, I believe, and you can see some of the parallels there, but he's actually a Catholic thinker, but he talks about political theory, political philosophy. That's a massive one. I'm super excited to interview him. I think that'll be really fun. Then I have one coming up with Leah Savas. She wrote that book that I had discussed, I think, in an earlier podcast called The Story of Abortion in America. It's like a super, super important book. It talks about the 400 years from the 1600s till now, how abortion has played out in America from a street level view. So you look through all of the documentation and all of the local court documentation of different abortion cases throughout history. It's very difficult to read, but it's a super, super important book to read in the current time period that we're living in. We're going to be talking about her book. We're also going to be talking about how she's actually a writer for World Magazine. She has a kind of a newsletter that focuses on abortion and the policies related to abortion that are taking place all over the country. And so she and I are going to discuss that. I think that's going to be an amazing podcast, and I'm really excited to be doing that. And then I am going to be doing one with a guy named Chris Bruno. This will be later in the month of October. He wrote this book called The Divine Christology of the Apostle Paul. It was Chris Bruno, John J.R. Lee, and Thomas R. Schreiner, but I have Chris Bruno on the podcast. First off, sweet artwork, absolutely sweet artwork. And so this is going to be a really, really fun interesting theological conversation. And then after that, and to wrap up October, I am going to be doing a 3-person conversation, me with, obviously I'll be in it, and then Austin Freeman, who I interviewed on Tolkien Dogmatics, the book he wrote about the systematic theology that he put together on Middle Earth. And then a guy named David Devil, who is a guy who's been on this podcast when he debated Nick on Catholicism versus Protestantism. We also talked about G.K. Chesterton on this podcast a couple of years back. He's a Catholic, and he's a super, super smart theologian. And he knows, both those guys know a ton about G.K. Chesterton. And so we're going to be breaking down Chesterton's 2 books, Heretics and Orthodoxy. And that's going to be awesome. And I think people will absolutely love that. I've also been doing a bunch of different podcasts with Rocket Sled Studios as we've moved into kind of the massive fundraising, the massive fundraising portion of the project. And those will be coming out. And we've got a really, really cool one that I've done with them that'll be releasing on that podcast and potentially on this podcast as well. That will be coming in October, November, where I sit down with Greg Silker, who I've talked to before. He's the owner of Silker Studios. He's the owner of Rocket Sled Studios. He's helped produce movies. Another guy that people should know, Cristobal Cruson. He's a director, producer. He's made a bunch of more international Christian films, but have been seen by, I think I've seen over 1 billion times. Many people have watched his movies. They've been very successful. And then Tim Mahoney. Tim Mahoney created the documentaries of Patterns of Evidence, in which he proved that the Exodus wasn't just some fairy tale, but that was actually a historical event. And he and I actually did a podcast together, but then we're doing a round table discussion with Greg, Chris, and Tim and myself. That'll just be a long form podcast about movies and the importance of story and why Christians need to be engaging with all of that sort of thing, story, movies, and how do we do that in this sort of culture. Anyways, those are just some of the podcasts that are coming up in the next 2 months. So I thought I'd try to give you a reason to subscribe to the YouTube, subscribe to the Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to this podcast. Make sure you subscribe because we've got some really, really good interviews coming up. Thanks for listening.